Daniel stepped into the grand hall of the Tsari capital, a massive structure carved from shimmering black stone. The air buzzed with conversation as diplomats, warriors, and scholars from various species gathered. He adjusted the collar of his uniform, trying to ignore the heavy stares he was receiving. As a human, he was used to attracting curiosity on alien worlds, but tonight, something felt off. Then he noticed her. Across the hall, a Tsari woman stood with her arms crossed, her piercing golden eyes locked onto him with a burning intensity. Unlike the others, her gaze was not one of curiosity. It was hatred. Daniel swallowed hard, feeling a strange chill crawl up his spine. He had never met her before, yet the way she glared at him made it seem like he had wronged her in the worst way possible. He looked away for a moment, trying to focus on his mission. The Tsari Alliance was considering deeper relations with humanity, and he was here as part of a diplomatic effort. But no matter how hard he tried, he felt her eyes drilling into him. Finally, unable to ignore it anymore, he turned back to her. She hadn't moved. She was still staring at him. Daniel frowned. Why? What had he done to deserve such hostility? He quickly ran through his past interactions with the Tsari. Nothing came to mind. He had only arrived on this planet 2 days ago. Deciding that avoiding her would only make things worse, he took a deep breath and walked toward her. As he approached, the surrounding Tsari stepped aside, as if sensing the tension in the air. The woman's expression remained unreadable, but her body tensed slightly, as if preparing for an attack. "Excuse me," Daniel said, keeping his tone calm and diplomatic. "Have we met before?" For a moment, she said nothing. Then, with a voice cold as steel, she replied, "You have no right to speak to me, human." The words struck harder than Daniel expected. "Look, I don't know what I did to offend you, but I think there's some kind of misunderstanding." The woman's fist clenched, and for a split second, he thought she might actually hit him. Instead, she took a step closer, her voice sharp with bitterness. "You have the face of a traitor," she said. "That is enough." Before Daniel could ask what she meant, she turned and walked away without another word. He stood there, frozen in confusion. A traitor? What was she talking about? Daniel had never betrayed anyone in his life. But as he watched her disappear into the crowd, a cold realization settled in. This wasn't just random hatred. It was personal. And he had no idea why. The next day, Daniel couldn't shake off the memory of her gaze. It had haunted him all night, her words repeating in his mind like an echo. "You have the face of a traitor." What did she mean? He had only been on this planet for a short time, and there was no way he had ever wronged anyone here. He decided he needed to get to the bottom of this. Velma, the mysterious Tsari woman, wasn't just some stranger. She was someone important. But who was she really? The next morning, Daniel made his way to the research archives in the Tsari capital, hoping to find any information about her. The quiet, almost eerie halls were filled with holographic screens and ancient alien texts. As he scrolled through records, he came across the name Velma, and a flood of information appeared before him. She was a warrior, one of the top-ranking members of the Tsari military. Her people were fierce, known for their strength and their long-standing history with humans, most of it filled with conflict and suspicion. Daniel had read about the past wars between humans and the Tsari, but he had no idea it went this deep. As he read more, he learned that Velma's family had been part of the Tsari leadership during the early conflicts. Her father was a renowned general who had died in battle against human forces. The death had been blamed on a human betrayal. A commanding officer, a man named Elias Carter, had made a fatal mistake, leading to the loss of many Tsari soldiers. It was a tragic event that had sparked the animosity between the two species. But there was more to the story than just hatred. The records hinted at a secret, something Daniel wasn't sure he could fully trust. Some sources suggested that Elias Carter hadn't been a traitor at all, but had been framed by others in the military who wanted the war to escalate. Feeling both confused and determined, Daniel set off to find Velma. He had to speak with her again and figure out if there was any truth to these old stories. Maybe she didn't know the full history. Maybe she could be reasoned with. When he finally found her, she was standing near a group of Tsari warriors, engaged in conversation. Her cold, unforgiving eyes immediately met his, and without a word, she dismissed her companions and stepped toward him. "You're back again," she said, her voice laced with a sharpness that made his stomach tighten. "Velna," Daniel began, trying to remain calm. "I've been looking into the history about Elias Carter, your father's death. I think you've been told a lie." Her eyes narrowed. "Don't you dare speak his name." She took a step forward, closing the gap between them. Her gaze was filled with fury, and for a moment, Daniel thought she might attack him. "I'm not here to argue about the past," he said, holding up his hands in peace. "I just want to know the truth. I want to understand why you hate me so much, why you've made me the face of a betrayal I didn't commit." For a long, tense moment, she said nothing. Then, with a sigh, she spoke in a softer tone. "Your kind doesn't deserve forgiveness." Daniel's heart sank, but before he could ask more questions, she turned and walked away again, leaving him standing in the middle of the room with even more questions than before. Her hatred was so deep, it felt almost like she was carrying the weight of her people's grief on her shoulders. Daniel couldn't understand it. How could someone hate him so much when he didn't even know them? But there was one thing he was sure of. He couldn't give up until he knew the whole truth. Something didn't add up, and he was determined to figure it out, even if it meant facing Velna again. Daniel spent the next few days gathering information, determined to uncover the truth. He knew he couldn't let it go, not after the way Velna had looked at him with such hatred. Every time he saw her, her words from the first encounter echoed in his mind. "You have the face of a traitor." He continued to research, digging into the archives and speaking with Tsari historians. The more he learned, the more he realized just how deep the conflict between humans and Tsari ran. There were records of bloody battles, betrayals, and misunderstandings, but there was one name that kept appearing again and again: Elias Carter. Elias Carter had been a commander in the human military during the early years of the Tsari conflict. He had been an influential figure, both respected and hated. But the more Daniel dug, the more confused he became. Some records painted Carter as a hero, a soldier who fought to prevent an even worse massacre. But others portrayed him as a traitor, a man who had sold out his allies and betrayed his comrades. Daniel felt a growing sense of unease. Why had the Tsari been so certain about Carter's betrayal? Why did they still hold that belief so strongly, even now, decades later? And why did Velna hate him so much if there was more to the story? One afternoon, he decided to visit a nearby human diplomat who had worked closely with the Tsari in the past. The diplomat, Marcus, was an older man who had lived through the wars and witnessed the tension firsthand. Marcus was sitting in his office when Daniel entered. The room smelled of old paper and a faint trace of incense. The walls were lined with books and records from past peace negotiations. He looked up as Daniel approached, his eyes tired but sharp. "Ah, Daniel," Marcus said, gesturing for him to sit. "What brings you here?" "I've been looking into something," Daniel said, sitting down across from him. "It's about Elias Carter and the Tsari conflict. I'm trying to understand what really happened." Marcus' face immediately darkened, and he leaned forward. "Ah, you've come to the right place," he said softly. "Carter was a good man. Too good, perhaps. But he was betrayed, just like the Tsari believe. The truth about him has been buried for too long." Daniel was taken aback. "What do you mean?" Marcus hesitated, glancing around as if to make sure no one could overhear them. Carter was framed. There were people within both human and Tsari ranks who wanted the war to continue. They used him as a scapegoat to escalate the conflict. But by the time Carter realized the truth, it was too late. Daniel's heart raced. So, the Tsari were wrong. Carter didn't betray them. "No," Marcus replied. But that's a hard truth for anyone to accept, especially after so many years of hatred. The Tseri, especially warriors like Velna, have been told the same story for decades. And now, to hear the truth, it's almost impossible for them to believe. Daniel stood up, his mind whirling. But how can I convince her? She won't even talk to me. Marcus looked at him with sympathy. You'll have to show her, Daniel. People like Velna, they need proof. They need to see the truth with their own eyes. And even then, it might not be enough. But if anyone can change her mind, it's someone like you. Daniel nodded, the weight of the task ahead heavy on his shoulders. He had to face Velna again, this time with the truth. But what if she wouldn't believe him? What if her hatred for him was so deep that nothing could change her mind? Daniel couldn't stop thinking about what Marcus had told him. The truth about Elias Carter being framed was a revelation, but it raised even more questions. If Carter had been wrongly accused of betrayal, why hadn't the Tseri ever learned the truth? Why was Velna, a member of one of the most influential families in Tseri society, still holding on to the lie? With a sense of determination, Daniel returned to his quarters that night and continued his research. He read through more records, including those from Tsari military archives, looking for something, anything, that could help prove what Marcus had said. Finally, he came across something that caught his attention. It was a hidden file, buried deep in the records, one that had been declassified only recently. It contained the official account of the final moments of the battle where Elias Carter had been blamed for the betrayal. But this record wasn't like the others. This one described a different side to the story, a side that had been deliberately omitted from the public narrative. According to the file, Carter had been set up by a high-ranking Tseri official, someone who had wanted the war to continue for their own gain. The evidence was clear. Carter had tried to warn his superiors about an ambush, but the Tseri leader had ignored him, hoping the battle would escalate. When things went wrong, Carter was left to take the fall. The more Daniel read, the more he realized that the Tseri had never been told the full story. The official history had been manipulated, and Velna's hatred was based on a lie that had been perpetuated for generations. His hand shook as he closed the file. The truth was right there, staring him in the face. Now, the next step was to show it to Velna. But how could he get her to believe him? Could he truly change her mind after everything she had been taught to believe? The next day, Daniel sought out Velna. He found her in a secluded area near the Tseri training grounds, where she often practiced with her fellow warriors. As usual, she was hard at work, her sharp movements a clear reflection of her skill. Velna, Daniel called out, walking toward her. She paused for a moment, but didn't turn to face him. Instead, she simply stared ahead, her expression cold. "I know what you're thinking," Daniel said, his voice steady. "And I need you to listen. I have the truth about Elias Carter, the truth you've never been told." Velna finally turned to face him, her golden eyes filled with suspicion. "You think you can change my mind with stories?" she asked, her tone icy. "I don't expect you to believe me right away," Daniel replied. "But you deserve to know what really happened. Carter was never a traitor. He was set up by someone who wanted the war to continue." Velna scoffed, stepping closer to him. "Why should I listen to you? You're just a human. What could you possibly know about my people's history, about my father's death?" Daniel's heart pounded in his chest. This was it, the moment of truth. He pulled out a data pad and handed it to her. "I didn't just read about it. I found the records. The truth is right here. If you truly want to understand, you need to see it for yourself." For a moment, there was only silence between them. Velna's eyes flickered from the data pad to Daniel, uncertainty creeping into her expression. Finally, with a sharp breath, she took the device from his hand and began reading the information. As she read, her expression changed, flickering between shock, disbelief, and confusion. Daniel stood by, waiting, but saying nothing. He knew it was going to be hard for her to accept. The truth often was. Finally, Velna lowered the data pad. She stared at Daniel, her face a mask of confusion and anger. "This is," she began, but her voice trailed off. "This is not what we were taught. It can't be." Daniel's voice softened. "It's the truth, Valna. Your father's death was part of a larger plan to keep the war going. You've been living with a lie." Valna's eyes glistened with unshed tears, her expression torn. "I don't know what to believe anymore," she whispered. Daniel took a careful step forward. "I know it's hard, but I'm here to help you find the truth, no matter how difficult it is." Valna stood there, the data pad in her hands, staring at the information Daniel had given her. Her expression was a mix of shock and disbelief. The room seemed to close in around them, the tension thick enough to be felt in the air. Daniel watched her carefully, trying to gauge her reaction. He had expected anger, confusion, maybe even a bit of relief, but he hadn't prepared for this kind of silence. Valna's golden eyes flickered as she read through the records once more, as if trying to make sense of the words that contradicted everything she had ever known. "I don't understand," Valna whispered, her voice shaky. "This can't be right. My father, he died because of Carter. Everyone knows that." Daniel stepped closer, his voice calm but firm. "I know, but your father wasn't the only one who died that day. A lot of Tsari lives were lost because of a mistake that was manipulated by those who wanted the war to continue. Carter wasn't a traitor. He tried to warn everyone, but he was betrayed." Valna's jaw clenched, and she quickly turned away from him, her fists tightening. "You don't understand, human. You're telling me lies. My people, my family, have suffered for decades. You expect me to just accept this story because you say it's true." "I don't expect you to just accept it," Daniel replied gently. "But you deserve to know the truth, Valna. You've been living with a lie all your life. Your hatred, your anger, it's all based on something that was never real." The words hit her harder than she expected. Valna took a deep breath, trying to push away the growing turmoil inside her. The anger was still there, but now it was mingled with something else, a deep sense of confusion. She had spent her entire life hating humans, hating Carter, and everything she believed in had suddenly been called into question. She paced back and forth, her mind racing. Why would they do this? Why would they frame him? Why would they want us to hate the humans even more? Daniel hesitated, choosing his words carefully. Because it served their interests. Some people in power wanted to keep the war going, to keep control over both the humans and the Sari. A long war means more power, more resources. But Carter, he didn't want that. He tried to stop it, and they used him as a scapegoat. Valna's face twisted with frustration. "But how do you know this? How can you be so sure?" "I found the records. I found the documents they didn't want anyone to see. Everything's here, Valna. The proof that Carter wasn't the monster they made him out to be." She turned back to face him, her expression colder now. "And why should I believe you? You're just a human. You might have some records, but that doesn't mean anything. The damage is already done. The war, the lives lost. It's all in the past. You can't change it." "I don't want to change the past," Daniel said, his voice steady but full of conviction. "But we can change the future. The Tsari deserve to know the truth, and so do you. The cycle of hatred and revenge doesn't have to continue. You can make a choice. You can choose to let go of the past and see things for what they really are." Valna looked at him, her eyes narrowing. She had always been a warrior, someone who relied on her instincts, her strength. But now, for the first time, she felt something deeper, vulnerability. The walls she had built around herself were cracking. "I don't know if I can just forget everything," she said quietly, almost to herself. "You don't have to forget," Daniel replied, his tone soft. "You just have to understand. Understanding is the first step toward healing, and you don't have to do it alone." For a long moment, Valna said nothing. She stood there, her mind spinning, trying to process the words. The pain of her past, the anger she had carried for so long, it wasn't going to vanish overnight. But Daniel had given her something to think about, something to hold on to. I need time, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel nodded. Take all the time you need. But when you're ready, we can face the truth together. For the next few days, Daniel could feel the weight of the truth pressing down on him. He had given Valina the evidence, shown her the hidden files, and now he waited. The tension between them had not gone away. It was as if the truth had opened a door, but Valina was still standing on the threshold, unsure whether to step through. Daniel continued his work on the Tsari base, hoping that time would allow her to process everything. But his thoughts were never far from Valina. Every time he saw her across the hall or on the training grounds, there was a sense of distance, almost like an invisible barrier that separated them, no matter how much he tried to bridge it with conversation. It wasn't until a week later that Valina approached him again. Human, her voice was as cold and sharp as ever, but there was something different in her eyes, a flicker of something he hadn't seen before. Curiosity, maybe even a hint of doubt. I need to talk to you. Daniel's heart skipped a beat. He stood up quickly. Of course, Valina. What's on your mind? She motioned for him to follow her. They'd walked in silence through the Tsari hallways until they reached a quiet garden, a place far from the eyes of others. The air was filled with the faint scent of alien flowers, and the atmosphere was calm, almost peaceful. But Daniel could feel the tension that still hung in the air between them. I've been reading the records you gave me, Valina began, her voice low. The ones about Elias Carter, and about the people who betrayed him. She paused, and for the first time, Daniel saw the uncertainty in her eyes. I don't know what to believe anymore. Daniel nodded, feeling a wave of sympathy for her. I understand. It's a lot to take in. She crossed her arms, staring out at the garden. For as long as I can remember, I've been told that Carter was the reason for everything. My father's death, the pain my people have suffered. It's all I've ever known. She took a deep breath. But what if I've been wrong all this time? What if everything I've been taught is a lie? Daniel stepped closer, his voice gentle but firm. The truth is hard, Valina, but it's not too late to change your beliefs. You don't have to carry the weight of the past if it's built on lies. She turned to face him, her golden eyes locked onto his. And if I can't let go, if I can't forgive the past, you don't have to forgive everything all at once, Daniel said, his tone soft. But you can make a choice. You can choose to look at the world differently. You can choose to see beyond the hate. And that doesn't mean forgetting your people's pain. It means breaking the cycle. Valina looked away, her face showing a mix of frustration and confusion. She had always been taught to be strong, to never show weakness. But now, for the first time, she felt vulnerable. The walls she had built around herself were cracking, and she didn't know how to hold them up. I don't know if I can do this, she whispered, almost to herself. I've lived with this anger for so long. I don't even know who I am without it. Daniel's voice was steady, his words sincere. You don't have to know right away. It's okay to take small steps. Healing is a journey, and you don't have to walk it alone. Valina took a step back, still unsure of where she stood, but there was something in her expression that told Daniel she was thinking, really thinking about what he had said. She was torn between the life she had always known and the possibility of something new, something that could change everything. I will think about it, she said softly. I need time. Daniel nodded, respecting her need for space. Take all the time you need, but when you're ready, I'll be here. The truth won't go anywhere, and neither will I. With that, Valina turned and walked away. But this time, she didn't feel as alone as she had before. There was a faint glimmer of hope in her heart, something she hadn't felt in years. Maybe, just maybe, things didn't have to stay the same. Maybe she could find a new path, a path that led away from hatred and toward understanding. The days that followed Valina's visit to the garden were filled with quiet moments of reflection. Daniel could sense that she was grappling with the truth, torn between the anger she had carried all her life and the realization that the past she had clung to might not be as it seemed. Daniel had hoped she would come to him for more answers, but she kept her distance. He knew it was too soon for her to fully accept the truth. Trust was not something that could be built overnight, especially when the very foundation of her beliefs had been shaken to its core. Then, everything changed one evening when a loud disturbance rattled the peaceful environment of the Tsari base. The sound of hurried footsteps and voices echoed through the hallways. Daniel stood up from his desk, sensing something was wrong. He moved quickly toward the noise, his heart beating faster with every step. He found Velna in the central chamber, surrounded by Tsari soldiers. Some of them looked nervous, others angry. Velna stood at the center, her face expressionless, but her eyes sharp, a clear sign of her commanding presence. "What's happening?" Daniel asked as he approached her, his voice laced with concern. "It's the council," Velna replied, her voice low and tense. "They've heard about the truth you uncovered. They want to suppress it before it spreads. They're afraid that if the truth gets out, it will undermine everything they've built. Their power, their control over the Tsari people." Daniel's stomach tightened. He had feared something like this might happen. The Tsari leadership was not likely to give up their narrative so easily. He looked at Velna, the woman who had once hated him, now standing tall, a force in her own right. "What are we going to do?" Daniel asked, stepping closer. Velna met his gaze, her expression fierce and determined. "We can't let them silence us. If the truth gets buried, then everything we fought for is meaningless. The Tsari deserve to know what really happened." Daniel nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. This wasn't just about Elias Carter or the past. It was about the future of both the human and Tsari people. The cycle of war, of hatred, had to end, and now was their chance to stop it. "We need help," Daniel said, his mind racing. "We can't do this alone. We need allies." Velna's eyes flickered with understanding. "The resistance," she said, almost to herself. "There are those among the Tsari who still believe in Carter's innocence, those who have kept the truth alive in secret. They'll support us." Without hesitation, Velna turned and began issuing orders to her fellow warriors. Her voice was commanding, filled with authority, and the soldiers quickly fell in line. Daniel watched in awe. This was the real Velna, the one who was no longer just the angry, vengeful warrior. She was now a leader, someone who was willing to fight for the truth, no matter the cost. Within hours, they had formed an unlikely alliance with the Tsari resistance. Daniel, Velna, and a small group of resistance members made their way to the Tsari High Council. The tension in the air was palpable as they approached the heart of Tsari power. The council was in session, and they would not take kindly to what was about to happen. Velna and Daniel stood at the front of the group. Velna was dressed in her finest battle armor, her expression fierce and unwavering. Daniel stood beside her, a calm but determined presence. As they entered the council chamber, the leaders of the Tsari turned to face them. There was a brief moment of stunned silence before the tension exploded into shouting. "You have no right to challenge the council, Velna," one of the leaders thundered. "I have every right," Velna said, her voice unwavering. "We're here to expose the truth, and we will not leave until it is heard." Daniel stepped forward, his voice steady and firm. "The truth cannot be silenced anymore. Elias Carter was innocent. Your lies have cost lives. It ends today." The room fell into silence again, this time a deeper kind of silence, a silence filled with uncertainty. The council knew that this was no empty threat. The Tsari people were starting to listen, and the resistance was growing stronger with every passing moment. Velna looked back at Daniel, her expression softer than it had ever been. For the first time, she truly saw him, not as a human who had once been an enemy, but as someone who had stood by her side in the fight for the truth. "We'll fight together," she said, her voice filled with conviction. The moment Vailna and Daniel stepped into the heart of the Tsari High Council's chambers, the tension was so thick it felt suffocating. The council members, powerful and seasoned in their authority, stared down at the two of them, their expressions a mixture of shock, disbelief, and anger. Vailna and Daniel, standing side by side, were no longer the strangers they once were. They had become allies, bound by a shared goal to uncover the truth. "What is this?" one of the council leaders demanded, his voice sharp and filled with accusation. "How dare you come here and accuse us of lies?" Vailna stood tall, her gaze unwavering. Her armor gleamed in the harsh light, a symbol of her warrior spirit, but it was her resolve that made her powerful now. "I've seen the truth, and I cannot stand by while you continue to deceive our people." Her voice rang out through the chamber, silencing the room. It was not the angry, vengeful cry of a warrior seeking revenge. No, it was the voice of a leader, someone willing to take a stand for what was right, even if it meant facing the most powerful figures in her society. "We are here to show the Tsari people the truth," Daniel added, stepping forward beside Vailna. His voice was calm, but there was fire in it. "Elias Carter did not betray your people. He was framed, and the truth has been hidden for far too long." A murmur swept through the council members, and Daniel could see the mixture of disbelief and fear in their eyes. For years, they had upheld the lie, a lie that had driven a wedge between humans and Tsari. It was clear that the truth would not be easily accepted. One of the council members, a woman with sharp, calculating eyes, stood up. "This is treason. You speak of truths, but you have no proof. The war was necessary. We could not allow peace to reign when it would weaken our people." Vailna's expression darkened. "The war has already weakened us. The suffering we've endured was based on a lie. Carter tried to prevent the massacre, but he was betrayed, and you allowed it to happen. You allowed it to happen." The room grew tense, and Daniel could feel the weight of the moment. This was more than just a battle for the truth. This was a battle for the future of the Tsari people. Would they continue to follow the lie, or would they choose to face the truth, no matter how difficult it was? "I found the records," Daniel said, holding up the data pad that contained the damning evidence. "The proof is here. Carter was not a traitor. He was a hero. You manipulated the facts to maintain control, and the blood of your own people is on your hands." The council members exchanged uneasy glances, their once imposing power beginning to crack under the pressure of the truth. Vailna stood beside Daniel, the fire in her eyes no longer fueled by hatred, but by something much stronger: justice. "You cannot erase the past," one of the leaders said, his voice trembling. "The war has been fought. Lives have been lost." "No," Vailna shot back. "You cannot erase the truth, and you will not make us continue to suffer for it. The people deserve to know the real story." Daniel stepped forward again, his tone unwavering. "The past cannot be changed, but we can choose how we move forward. We can heal, but only if we are brave enough to accept the truth." The room was silent now. The tension was unbearable, and Daniel felt the weight of it bearing down on him. This was the moment. The truth was out, and it was up to the Tsari people to decide whether they would stand with it or allow the lies to continue. A long, tense silence hung in the air. Finally, the leader who had been most vocal in their defense stood up. His eyes were filled with regret, and his voice was softer now. "If what you say is true, then we have done a terrible disservice to our people." Vailna's gaze softened, but there was still strength in her voice. "It's not too late to change. It's not too late to do what's right." Another council member stood, his voice hesitant. "What do you propose? A war with no purpose? A people divided?" "No," Vailna said firmly. "We propose peace. True peace, the kind that comes from understanding, not from hatred." The room fell into an uneasy silence as the council members weighed the decision before them. Finally, the leader who had spoken earlier spoke again, his voice heavy with emotion. "If we are to move forward, he said. We must confront the past, and we must ensure that the truth is heard by all. Velna and Daniel exchanged a look, a silent understanding passing between them. This was only the beginning, but it was a victory nonetheless. The truth had been heard. The silence that followed the council's decision was thick, as if the room itself was holding its breath. For years, the Tseri people had lived under the shadow of a lie that had kept them divided and at war with humans. But now, for the first time, the truth was out in the open. There was no going back. Velna and Daniel stood side by side, their eyes locked on the council members. The decision had been made. They would no longer hide the truth. The Tseri people would know what had really happened with Elias Carter, and the consequences of that truth would ripple through the entire planet. But the road ahead was far from easy. I knew it would be hard, Velna said quietly, her voice tinged with both relief and uncertainty. But I didn't expect it to feel so heavy. Daniel nodded, understanding her emotions. For years, Velna had carried the weight of her father's death and the hatred toward humans that had been passed down through generations. But now, with the truth in the open, everything was different. The Tseri could no longer live in ignorance. They had to face their past, whether they were ready or not. We've taken the first step, Daniel said, but the hardest part is still to come. Velna turned to him, her eyes full of determination. We've exposed the lie, but the battle isn't over. The council might have accepted the truth, but there are still many who will fight to keep it hidden. There will be resistance. The people won't just accept this overnight. Daniel knew she was right. There would be those who didn't want things to change. The old guard, the ones who had benefited from the war and the lies, would fight to hold on to their power. But the truth was powerful, and it had a way of spreading faster than lies ever could. We can't do this alone, Daniel said, looking at the group of resistance members who had fought beside them. We need to reach the Tseri people. They need to know the truth for themselves, not just from the council. Velna nodded. We'll need to use everything at our disposal. Broadcasts, public speeches, everything. We have to make sure this message spreads to every corner of the planet. The days that followed were a blur of activity. Velna and Daniel, along with the resistance, worked tirelessly to spread the truth. They used every means available to them, from public speeches in the bustling cities to secret broadcasts to the farthest reaches of the Tsari colonies. Slowly, but surely, the truth began to take root. But it wasn't easy. There were protests, anger, and even violence in some areas. Many Tseri didn't want to believe the truth. For so long, they had been taught that the human enemy was to blame for everything that had gone wrong in their world. Now that narrative was being shattered, and some couldn't handle the weight of it. Velna found herself torn between her duty to the truth and her duty to her people. She had spent so much of her life holding on to the pain of her father's death, the pain of betrayal. Letting go wasn't easy, but she knew it was the right thing to do. For the first time, she felt like she was fighting for a better future, not just for her people, but for all Tseri and humans alike. We're making progress, Daniel said as they stood together in a quiet moment. They were in a small room, away from the noise of the world outside. But it's going to take time. There are still a lot of scars to heal. Velna looked at him, her eyes softening. I never thought I'd see the day where we'd be on the same side. Daniel smiled, a rare and genuine expression. I never thought I'd see the day where you'd be standing by my side. Their alliance had grown into something more than just a partnership. They were no longer enemies. They were allies, bound by a shared vision for a new future, one where the Tseri and humans could finally live in peace. But there was still a long road ahead. The battle for the truth was far from over. The Tseri people were waking up to the reality of their past, but the forces that had once controlled them were not going to give up easily. As Velna looked out at the horizon, she felt a sense of hope she had never known before. It wasn't the kind of hope that came with easy victories. No, this was the kind of hope that came with a battle fought and won, one small step at a time. "Whatever happens next," she said, her voice steady and resolute, "we fight for the future. For a future where the truth isn't just something we tell, but something we live by." Daniel nodded, his expression filled with the same determination. Together. And for the first time, Velna truly believed that they could make it happen. The truth was their weapon, and together, they would use it to change the future of their world. The days following the broadcast of the truth were tense, but there was also a sense of change in the air. Velna and Daniel had seen the Tseri people react in many ways, some with anger, some with disbelief, and others with a tentative hope. The truth had shattered the foundation of their world, and it was impossible to tell how it would all play out. But Velna knew one thing. They had taken the first step toward a new future. They had traveled to different cities, spoken to crowds of people, and spread the truth as far as it could go. The resistance, now growing stronger with each passing day, had helped amplify their message, and slowly, the truth began to take root in the hearts and minds of the Tsari people. Velna stood at the edge of a tall building, overlooking the city. The sun was setting, casting an orange glow over the skyline. For the first time in her life, she wasn't looking at the world through the lens of anger and revenge. Instead, she felt a quiet sense of peace, something she had never thought possible. Daniel approached, standing beside her. "It's hard to believe how much has changed in such a short time," he said, his voice reflecting the same wonder. "But there's still a long way to go. We can't let up now." Velna nodded, her eyes fixed on the horizon. "I know. Some people will never accept the truth, no matter how many times we show it to them. But we've reached enough people to start something real. A change is happening, and it can't be stopped." The sound of footsteps behind them made them both turn. A small group of Tseri resistance members approached, led by Korin, a warrior who had stood by their side from the beginning. His face was lined with exhaustion, but there was a glimmer of something else: determination. "We've done it," Korin said, his voice filled with pride. "The message has spread, and the council has agreed to officially acknowledge the truth. The Tseri people will know what really happened, and the blame will finally be lifted from Carter's name." Velna felt a rush of emotion at his words. It wasn't just about Carter anymore. It was about the future, about a new path that didn't rely on the pain of the past. She had been so consumed by the idea of revenge for so long, but now she could see the possibility of forgiveness, not just for Carter, but for herself and her people. "This is just the beginning," Daniel said, a smile tugging at his lips. "Now we have to rebuild, but we can do it." Velna turned to him, her heart swelling with gratitude. "We've come a long way, haven't we? From enemies to allies. And now, partners." Daniel smiled back, his eyes softening. "I never imagined this would be how we'd end up, but I'm glad we did." There was a brief moment of silence between them, filled only by the sound of the wind and the distant hum of the city. Velna glanced at Daniel, then back to the horizon. A part of her had always believed that she was destined to carry the weight of her people's anger forever. But now, with the truth laid bare, she felt a sense of release, a freedom she hadn't thought possible. For the first time in years, she felt the weight of the past lift from her shoulders. It didn't mean that everything was suddenly perfect. The road ahead would be filled with challenges. There would always be those who resisted change. But they had done something incredible. They had opened the door to a new future. "There's still a lot to do," Velna said, turning to face the others. "But for the first time, I'm not fighting alone." Korin stepped forward, a smile on his face. "We're with you, Velna. We always will be." And with that, the group stood together, looking out over the city. The sun had nearly set, and in the fading light, Velna saw something she had never seen before: hope. The future was uncertain, but it was theirs to shape. Together,